I wonder, is a tool on top to solve this just a lovable, bold query prompt away? Is it going to be so super fucking difficult to prompt your way to an interface that a human then can interact with, right? But until we have solved that, I think it's a pretty fast stretch to kind of replace all of those SaaS tools.
I think the jury is still out there also because it is early days. Like hearing story about some of these solutions exposing API keys, which is not a great thing. We're hearing stories of folks who build their own little SaaS company with zero coding experience and now can't scale the foundation. It breaks bugs everywhere because they don't know infrastructure. Building AI software is like 20% AI and 80% like engineering. You still need to know what architecture looks like.
It's the quote is much more funny than that. It's 5% AI and 100% engineering.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah. Anyway, what I wanted to do is I took your profile picture and I just gave it some very factual, correct information about who you are and kind of, your experience, where you're from, that kind of stuff. And basically, what it told me was to go F myself. That's what it told me. It's like, I can't create that kind of image where we kind of glorify controversial historical figures, symbols, or regimes, included those associated with German army leadership during World War II. I didn't say that. I didn't tell it to do anything on World War II. It just read between the lines, which is just effing amazing. Anyway,
you should do it. You should do it on Grok and
they won't care.
I'm sure it's going to work out. What I saw was like, which media outlet should trust more, the New York Times or your X feed? And then and that was basically like the New York Times is shit for those reasons, and you can't trust it, blah, blah. No, the opinion of the people, that's on X. No, you only get it on X.
No, it's like first-hand factual information you're getting. Yeah. What could possibly go wrong? Like, I'm just saying, finally we can figure out what happens at area 9, 16, whatever, area 51. It's like, I need to go on X and fact check myself. But yeah, you're right. I think you're right. Anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about AI today because there's a company that's basically just slashing everything and just, plugging in AI, and they're doing amazing. I don't know if they're doing amazing, but, we're going to talk about that.
So I think you guys have probably heard about this one before. We're talking about Klarna today. Klarna is a payment provider and I think kind of a buy now, pay later of guys, right? I think at the height of their story, they were valued at $45 billion, privately held, $45 billion. And now I think I want to say 4 or 5 years later, after that valuation, they're now aiming to go public between 15 and 20 billion, which is, still insanely fantastic, but it just feels, you only got half the way to 45 billion, right? It's pretty nuts actually. Yeah. It's like how to poop on a 15 billion valuation is like say that they were recently, before that valued higher. Anyway,
I just feel like honestly, this is a point where we can finally blame finance. They could have moved a lot faster with this IPO stuff, so they could have materialized that 45 billion. Just saying. I think this is probably finance fault.
Yeah, time was the problem for the 45 billion not to materialize. And then, I think this is obviously, and we will continue the story arc throughout the conversation and probably kind of get to it in the end if we're disciplined enough. Not sure about that, Mikkel. No. But they wanted to go public now for a while.
Yeah, for the last 2-3 years, I think, at least.
Yeah, and it's not like, so I think now it's going to happen in 25. They're kind of doing all of that stuff, it's kind of gearing up. But whenever you want to go public, like you and I, we know these things.
Yeah, we've done it so many times.
It's obviously a multi-year prep for this to happen, right? Yeah. And I think, especially with the turn of events, we talked about this so many times on the show of like, hey, capital costs something, and you can't just burn money and yada, yada. And especially if you want to go public, now the public wants to see someone actually making a profit, like a real company, and not burning through cash like crazy. They had a pretty tall mountain to climb in front of them to change their profile to go public, to kind of be interesting, make this an interesting public company basically. And one of the major feats, and I think you can fact check me on this, but they were at some point, 3 years ago, something like this. I think they burned through $1 billion a year in terms of cash burn, just like money literally leaving their bank account never to come back, and then now turned this around to be sub 50 million annual burn or something like this, and on track to go profitable from that.
Yeah. We'll probably see when their S1 drops. I don't know if it's out yet. Actually, I haven't seen it. The number I had was from mid 24. Around that time, they had like 30 something in burn. So obviously it could change if a lot of costs just landed in the second half. Who knows? But I doubt that is going to materially change relative to what the numbers have been, right? So
yeah. So let's just say it like it is. They, did a pretty good, amazing job here, going from $1 billion in burn to something else.
Yeah. Burning a Series A company a year, basically.
Yeah,
maybe
sure. Sure. The thing though is, and this is the story that they've always been pushing. And we're going to get to kind of, is this BS or not later. But one of the predominant stories that they've been pushing is like, hey, AI. We figured something else internally in terms of AI. I think it's safe to say that $1 billion in annual saving, you can't get there with just some tooling replacements. The majority of that burn reduction, sure, so there's some growing revenues in there too. The majority of that burn reduction came from people's salaries.
Yeah.
Let's just be super clear about this, right? And I think this is also setting this up a little bit. It's like, well, was this AI story of them like kicking out Salesforce, kicking out Workday, doing all, I think some posts were saying, that they replaced over 1,200 apps from 400 to 500 vendors with their AI strategy. Was that helped them to, save $1 billion a year? Or was it really just the nicer, bigger story that they could put front and center while they were showing all of these people, with the doors? And I think there's probably a little bit of a mix in here. I think we have a pretty good understanding kind of what the lopsided view on this is. But I think this is what we wanted to talk about today.
Yeah, so really, it's funny how the events unfolded, right? We talked about this. The first story I remember hearing was around them firing a bunch of people. And I think it's natural for you and I maybe to have seen that on LinkedIn because of second-degree connections working there, honestly. Then you get exposed to kind of when 1,000 people lose their job or 700 in support lose their job, it creates a lot of noise, honestly. And I think to your point, making the argument that, hey, now they've slashed 1,200 apps. That's how they went from 1 billion in burn to like almost zero. Laughable. I gotta admit, like the one thing I remember from business school going to uni, and it's just the one probably, is, well, the best way to reduce cost is fire people. That's that's the best, fastest, easiest way. It's where most of the cost goes anyway. And it's the same for software companies, funny enough. It's not like the server bills.
No, but let's just jump into, because you mentioned people, let's maybe jump into this example first. So one of the things that they were able to replace a lot or kind of bring down a lot is their customer response times.
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
I think this is more like a customer service bot that people have been talking about, right? And I think, when I'm thinking about, okay, how can you reduce the amount of salaries you pay? I think that's a super straightforward one.
Yeah.
Like we can, it's unclear how much that really kind of reduced cost, but probably quite a bit, right? So, and I saw them cite that they went from 12 minutes average response time, and they have this B2C site that's kind of taking so much volume here, right? And super simple questions, obviously, for them, but they took it from 12 minutes to 2, right? Frankly, that's not bad,
no,
right? Kind of, we can poop all over the place for all the other things, but that one is really actually not bad.
Yeah.
And then, in connection with that, you also see you probably don't need as many folks there anymore, right? So I think that is the clearest thing for me, where I'm like, okay, we're not talking about the Salesforce license cost.
No.
Let's just say that kind of, that's actually, I think that's BS. And I think Sebastian, what's his last name?
W.
Matovsky, like I don't think he's saying that, not sending money to Salesforce is what drove this thing around, right? But I think the first and clearest one is really on the, hey, they deployed this customer service thing and kind of helped, things to go better, right? And I think that's pretty believable.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty believable.
I mean, supposedly it's taken care of 2/3 of all the requests, right? I think you also hear similar kind of rumblings from Intercom and the like that they're able to resolve a bunch of tickets, right? So I think that makes complete sense. It is also one of the more cost-intensive areas for sure for that company, because there will be challenges, as far as I understand, between merchants and buyers. There might be disputes there, which are just more complicated to handle, right? And so supposedly that solution is doing the work of 700 folks, which is why they've been cut from the roster, apparently, right? So here's, I think, the tricky part is making the leap from having cut people to AI being the solution, right? And I think you and I have talked on and off air probably about this already, where it's, hey, is that shaping IPO conversation? I don't know if we're going to get to that in a second. Probably we are. So let's maybe park that for now.
That's right. So, and I think kind of this is one piece where it's like extremely clear that there's like cost savings included here. I think the topic that comes up most of the time when we're talking about Klarna is apparently their internal chatbot Kiki, which, you know, even when you say that, I think it's kind of cute, but also sounds kind of funny, right? Yeah. And basically, there are kind of two parts to this story. One is what was the issue that they encountered there, and number two, then how did they solve this, right? And I think the number one part in terms of what's the issue, and, you know, Sebastian talks about this in this like couple of podcasts, actually kind of quite intensively, it's like he's talking about, you know, in different words, but he's talking about data being dispersed or fragmented, or knowledge being fragmented and kind of being all over the place, and kind of the sheer amount of cost of employees trying to find that data and tapping into this and all that stuff, right? And what I found pretty interesting was apparently they wanted to solve this problem. Sounds like a really, like a high-flying, edgy, you need to be valued $45 billion to even think about solving this problem internally kind of problem. And they were looking apparently at Wikipedia, and they were looking at other places where knowledge is being kind of managed.
The CEO asked his blood boy, and
yes. And what they came out of is, or came out with, but, you know, out of that research, they came out of it and kind of had an idea, an epiphany, that they basically wanted to use a knowledge graph. Yeah. So what is a knowledge graph? It's a you know, a different kind of database. It doesn't work in tables, like in columns and rows, like how you and I think about databases. It's not called a relational database, by the way. It's super confusing, but basically kind of it has, think about like a network, like a social network, and with nodes and with like lines connecting those nodes and arrows and all that stuff, right? Kind of think about this meme of this guy that's like on the wall with those red kind of, you know, threads connecting. That but organized, right? Yeah. That but organized. That's what a graph is in general, right?
I would have bet you said something with a sheet there and, you know, columns and, but okay, keep going.
What do you mean?
Like a graph. You're like the numbers guy, the data guy.
Oh, that's right.
It's like, oh, a sheet. I want to do some graphs. It's like, no, it's like a spider web.
And it's also fancy, you know, it's like, you know, a knowledge graph and stuff. So that's what they actually started building, right? And what is pretty interesting there is they, you know, obviously sucked up, you know, data from slides and from Notion and from like other unstructured places and made this accessible for their employees to ask questions, right? And I think that particular one, and we're gonna discuss build and buy actually in a second, but that particular one, and I would actually say all the examples, which is kind of cool, all of these examples have either since spawned in industry of tools that are kind of solving this, or have been doing this, you know, around the time, maybe a little bit before, right? And this particular knowledge graph on like this, you know, all of this tech stuff is basically, I think we heard about Glean now. Someone else mentioned Sierra. There's like enterprise search with Perplexity, kind of, they're doing all of that stuff basically, right? And the first application that they basically have there was a internal chat app called Kiki that they then, you know, use to answer, you know, all kinds of different questions, right? Kind of that's really the starting point. So they're going from, you know, fragmented data to, hey, here's one place where you can engage with that, and that one place is, by the way, Slack. So it's pretty straightforward, actually.
I think the cool thing here is also like when you think about the amount of tools companies tend to just add, your data get dispersed in so many different places, which in itself is actually a risk. It's a little bit of a risk you got to be mindful of. And I think obviously Klarna, they will have some kind of a CDO or CIO who cares about that stuff, where it's like, you know, they're going to love sitting in a meeting discussing how we can consolidate, cut some tools and just consolidate the data for not just safety purposes, but also efficiency. I think the other cool thing with the internal chat search, with the enterprise search, Kiki, it served 250,000 queries so far, according to Klarna. I don't know how long ago this was, but it's roughly 2,000 daily requests they're taking through that solution. Think about it, they're like 4,000 people. It's half the team running some kind of query every day. So definitely, you know, great internal tool they most likely have built there. And I also can see the appeal. You are like in a finance industry, usually very regulated, by the way, right? Incredibly regulated. So for Glean or someone else to pass all the security checks will be difficult. Like, honestly, we've heard stories of companies much bigger than Glean getting thumbs down in this sector in Europe because of security purposes. Like, so I think building it yourself will still unlock that utility.
No, absolutely. I think where the Klarna guys went further than Glean, by the way, is Glean is very much focusing on, your Google Drive, your Notion, your Slack, kind of that kind of stuff. The Klarna guys apparently also integrated the ERP, like where the finance stuff is. I think they did, similar stuff with, we're going to get to that, to their Salesforce and kind of their CRM stuff, the HR systems and so forth. Which is really interesting because you can do a bunch of things on top, right? And basically creating that knowledge graph of the entire organization. Like, first of all, that's a big undertaking, right? The other thing is you kind of take all of the fragmented data and knowledge and kind of create a place that you as a human can't navigate either, by the way, but the AI can, which is why this is so interesting, right? Which is also, by the way, why we are building the knowledge graph for the go-to-market here at Adif, right? Kind of that's actually kind of where we're seeing, some folks like Lean and Perplexity not spending a whole lot of time and trying to fix that. It's really kind of trying to understand how does the whole go-to-market actually hang together? How does that data and knowledge kind of hang together? And then deploying AI on top in order to kind of go through this, right? What I think Klarna did extremely interestingly here, and this is now moving from a general written stuff knowledge graph to also applying it for tools, is they famously deprecated Salesforce, right? And kind of thinking about that, right? Completely insane. Like, you don't buy Glean or Perplexity and then deprecate Salesforce. It doesn't work like that, right? Kind of that's not the way you can go about this. But basically what they realized is, okay, the CRM is also just a fucking database that people need to maneuver. And what they started to do once they, took all of that structure away from the CRM, is like, hey, you know what? Actually, we can now have people use a different interface to get the same stuff done, right? And I think you and I had a really, prepping this show back and forth, kind of, did this CRM thing really happen? Is it true? I think we looked up how many CRM admins they still have in the organization, and they're Salesforce certified. Did Mark Benioff, rebuke this whole thing? So I think there's some truth to the whole thing. Whether or not this was the right move and whether or not this is, blowing this up more than it should, I don't 100% know yet, right? But what we do know, at least from some of the interviews that we've seen, some of the information online we've seen, is that, many workflows that used to happen in the CRM in a desktop kind of interface are apparently now happening on Slack. Funny enough, obviously Slack is owned by Salesforce, so kind of they didn't quite leave Salesforce in that regard, but a lot of those workflows actually kind of have been potentially ported away, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I just find it funny that they went from firing a bunch of people and that being extremely negative, plus they wanted to IPO. What do you do when AI all of a sudden is all the craze? Well, you have an opportunity to change the story. I'm sorry. And then hearing the CEO go, I was so embarrassed when Mark Benioff was asked about why Klarna is churning. I was like, that's such BS. Come on. Even if it's true you churn from Salesforce, that's an amazing thing to get mentioned there ahead of an IPO. I'm sorry. This is like a wonderful story. You have to realize this company is competing with another big BNPL vendor. There's actually two. There's Square, which is now called Block, which then was called XYC, which I don't know, probably is going to be called something else really soon. And then you have Adyen as well, right? You need to basically create an investor story of how you're different from those two other massive vendors to justify a massive billion-dollar valuation. And I think this was just super convenient. You, number one, are able to change the conversation away from the people you let go and build a story of how you're, basically a forward-thinking company using AI to your advantage to slash cost and everything else. Like, I think it's a wonderful story to tell for investors. Do we know whether they churned on Salesforce? Like, truly, I think probably Mark Benioff would have said their customer if they actually were. Like, I think he would have said that most likely. The thing is, though, to your point, we literally checked before recording. They have folks who are CRM specialists on payroll, who are still working there today, who are specialized in Salesforce. Doesn't mean that they're operating Salesforce, but probably there's something still running. We're going to talk about Deal in a minute, by the way, where I just find it very convenient that they are able to replace in that scenario a bunch of workflows that they don't need the HR software to do, but they will need HR software to do payroll, right? There's still some things you will need
and
to
I
do.
think actually that gets to the heart of this whole thing, which I think is extremely interesting.
Yeah.
Which is, we've built up tens of thousands of SaaS tools. You and I know from a marketing perspective, you focus on the one thing it does.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like the one thing, not the other 20,000 things, the one thing. When you go on Stripe's website, it's still, run payments, or I don't know what they're saying, but like they have like 8 or 10 other products, by the way, that people are buying, but that's what they're focusing on, right? And really, when you strip it all down, every single SaaS tool probably only has one single purpose, like one single purpose. And I would say, and this is kind of what's kind of interesting here, some of those SaaS tools that have a single purpose can get easily replaced if you have the right data. If you have access to the right data, then kind of that stuff can easily get replaced, right? I think to a degree, this is what happened here with Salesforce. Yeah. The key skills that need to be managed is still applied. That's why you have those CRM admins. I think they probably have a different interface if they're not still using Salesforce, by the way, to your point, right?
One alternative.
But the exactly. Well, anyway, but I think the deal story is kind of interesting. So what happened here? They famously went out to say like, hey, so Klarna, we killed Salesforce and we, planning to kill Workday, in the coming weeks or something like this, right? So, okay, well, that was interesting. And then later, came out that, we switched to deal. Yeah. It's like, well, wait a minute. That feels... I get the Salesforce to Slack, sure. No, I get it. But the competitor A to competitor B, that's kind of weird. So we double clicked on this for you guys, so you don't have to. And basically, and I think that puts it into an interesting perspective. They basically realized that, running payroll on like 50 different countries.
Yeah, difficult.
We're not going to do that.
Yeah, taxes alone. Like, sure, AI can tell us, but do we want to trust it with that kind of information? Yeah. What if we do wrong taxes for employees for half a year and they get dinged and we screw everyone? It's like, no, not doing that, not taking that risk.
So that core part of the use case, they have still with the vendor. What they stripped away from, in that switch, I would call it some of the more softer HR things around the organization. So, for example, org structure, who reports to whom, what's the job description, who does what, those assessments. And like some of these pieces basically went into the graph, right? That's how they're kind of doing this. This went into the graph. And then they have core use cases with Deal, which is basically payroll and taxes for payroll that kind of still sit there, right? And I think also makes sense. He also mentioned another interesting use case around this employee graph piece that they built there, which is basically, and again, apparently they're not companies solving that use case, by the way. So it's basically, instead of sending, everyone a culture amp or lattice, questionnaire, kind of tick the box, done, which left them a lot of room for subjectivity. Like, it's like, I know Mikkel scored red again, but, the team is difficult. Kind of that kind of thinking. And what they did instead, using their own tools, using their own graph and rack and what have you, they deployed an AI chatbot to every single of their, thousands of employees. And we're like, hey, would you mind spending half an hour talking to this chatbot about, what you think are Klarna's strengths and benefits and where do we need to improve and so on and so forth. They did this for all of these employees. They spent half an hour on this thing. And then the AI came back with very clear instructions for all the different levels of the organization where there are things to improve, right? Sure, you can say, okay, now the subjectivity you now just offloaded to an AI, but I've used culture amp before, and I've sat in those painful employee feedback sessions there, and it was all over the place. And having some AI help me with that, I can see the value in something like this, right? And again, this is like one of those things where they basically took a use case that comes out of the box with Workday that then moved into their own AI environment, so to speak.
I also just feel like we're at a point where the reason a company like this and others, by the way, they're not alone, considers building their own stuff is all the infrastructure hasn't been built yet. It's like we discovered gold, now we need to build up the mining industry. And that's going to take a while. Like we need railroads, we need like specialized tooling and all these kind of pieces. It's just not there yet. Honestly, lots of vendors have been quick to add AI to their software. But for most, I think it's also about reinventing the company, which honestly is just way more difficult. And then you look at the disruptions, it's like years out. For me, I think it's a great example. Don't get me wrong. I think they've built some cool stuff. I don't think you can take away from that from the company. Do I believe this is like a narrative for IPO? Yeah, I totally do. I have to admit it. Like I see so many problems with just going in and shutting down 1,200 tools. Like just the amount of work itself it creates is just insurmountable, to be honest, right? And we've not even discussed the details of ripping out Salesforce. What about all the other dependencies you have, all the other activities you're performing? There's so much there, and we've not seen folks en masse go out and discuss how they've done it in detail. We get very little information out of this, even from past employees. So dubious. I think what does become interesting to discuss, though, is given where we are today, should you actually go and build this stuff yourself, or should you go and buy it? Because it's not the first time we've had this conversation. It's just not the first time companies have considered building their own whatever solution. And I think ultimately what you have to look at is, do you have solutions out there that can fix your problem? And is it the best use of your resources? Even engineers like cost money, even if it's just time they're going to have to spend, and you're going to be left with the maintenance of it. Google, they tried to build basically a deal kind of thing way back. They had to abandon it. It didn't work out, and then buy a solution to take care of that side of their operations, right? So I think I'm very curious to see how this involves, and also just to hear your thoughts on this. It's still super early. So
let's talk build versus buy, right? And those are also questions that the Sebastian guy has been getting, asked a lot. And I think he has kind of not a strong answer, I think. Part of his answer is like, well, when we did this thing, these other companies kind of went around or went like as a clear choice that they are now, et cetera, et cetera. And, hey, we built this use case and, half a year later, we see a company building this use case, right? So there's a timing aspect to it, right? And the reason why this is weak is because that might be very different for everyone listening. Oh, you didn't build a knowledge graph yourself yet? So maybe then that's, that is then the only timing piece here, right? Yeah. The other thing he mentioned, which I also don't think is super, super strong. It's powerful, don't get me wrong, but it's not super strong as we had a bunch of learnings in AI doing this stuff, right? Kind of that we then use for us internally, yada, yada, yada. I'm not so sure. I think there's certainly learnings here, but does that really outweigh all of this other stuff that kind of, it's very expensive learnings. Let's just put it like this.
Let's say they just used all the resources to figure out great AI solutions for their customers instead of themselves. Like very different. They will still have learnings, by the way.
They did, by the way. And all of that stuff. But still, it's that it's a little bit like when I hear people say like, oh, we have we invest in a massive SDR team, so we have a good talent pipeline for the AEs. It's like, wait a minute, like that should be, sure, it should be a part of the reason, but is it the whole, that's a very expensive talent attraction kind of, thing you're running there. So anyway, right? So I'm not sure, is that the right thing? I do believe in this whole issue of fragmented knowledge and data. I believe in that. I think there needs to be a way out. Unclear if this is a Glean, if this is a Perplexity, if there's something like Adder for the go-to-market space. Unclear if that's the answer. But that certainly is the problem. Yeah. Like that certainly is the problem, right? And what I then think is kind of cool, and this brings me to my next kind of thought here in this build versus buy, is like, once you kind of have the data stuff under control, like once you have the underlying kind of data piece under control, whether that's, data from Notion and, Google Drive and other places, or your Salesforce, your Zendesk, your Gong, building an interface on top for people to, work with and manipulate it becomes a fairly simple thing, actually. So, and the way kind of we're thinking about this, so kind of we have a graph for the go-to-market, you can hook it in. And right now, ask Claude to build a dashboard. Like, okay, oh wow, Tony, awesome. But, the leap isn't so far to ask Claude to build a forecasting tool, or to build a lead scoring tool, or to build a, whatever tool on top. And this won't be the 100% solution, but it will be the 80% solution for that specific problem, right? And if you then go further down the road, if you have all the data under control, whether it's go to market or for HR or for finance or for everything, I wonder, is a tool on top to solve this just a lovable, bold query prompt away? Is that where we're kind of walking towards, where people just, once they have the data piece in place and the AI understands all of that stuff, is it going to be so super fucking difficult to prompt your way to an interface that a human then can interact with? Kind of that's a little bit of my question that I have, kind of where this whole thing is going, right? But until we have solved that, I think it's a pretty fast stretch to kind of replace all of those SaaS tools.
I think the jury is still out there also because it is early days. Like, we're hearing story about some of these solutions exposing API keys, which is not a great thing. We're hearing stories of folks who build their own little SaaS company with zero coding experience and now can't scale the foundation. It breaks bugs everywhere because they don't know infrastructure. Or like, you and I have seen this kind of thing. Building AI software is like 20% AI and 80% like engineering. You still need to know what architecture looks like.
It's the quote is much more funny than that. It's 5% AI and 100% engineering.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, strawberry.
No, but so I totally believe that. But also, kind of, hey, let's not fucking forget, like Lovable, they have like tens of thousands of happy users.
Sure.
Like I recently built a website. It's nuts. It's nuts, and we still need to grapple with what that actually means. But I think there will be for the SMB in the beginning and later on for something else, but there will be a little bit of like, hey, let's just prompt this thing together here.
Yeah.
Unclear how that's going to develop.
I think the interesting thing, potentially that's not being discussed, that could play out, if you look at the good old car industry, there's one vendor who did vertical integration. And that vendor was Tesla. And it gives them such upside in building software that the others can't.
What a great current example.
Great. But because the others have to go to all these OEMs, all these suppliers, and have them build certain things in certain ways. If you now contrast this to software, Klarna is building basically their own apps internally. This is like not only a mode, it's going to be hard for the competition to copy because they don't know how they've built it. And it's going to potentially give them an upside in how they want to expose data, how they want to integrate the stack, what they want to be able to do. It just comes with all the burdens of maintaining the software and actually building it, right? So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this develops, whether someone is going to make a bet on basically saying, no, we're not going to buy all this good old shelfware, which it is now. We're going to develop our own stuff because it's much more efficient. Yeah. It's not just about the cost. It's actually about what value we can create as a business. And I think that potentially remains to be seen. It's also going to be very different. All vendors who sell software, they have an ROI calculator and some ROI quote. And then there's the reality, which is, did you get some ROI from that tool? It's like, well, don't know, maybe.
I gotta say, kind of this whole Satya Nadella on like, oh, SaaS is dead, and like, he didn't say those words, but like something like that, a couple of months ago felt very far away for me. Like very far in my head. I was like, oh, come on. Like, you're just trying to sell your fucking Copilot. Come on, let's not blow this out of proportion. I think what has changed in my mind, I didn't use, credit where credit is due. I didn't use Lovable. I used the base 44. And I could just sit there as a non-technical guy and kind of, prompt this thing. And it was generating good stuff.
Yeah.
Like, and I think that is different.
Yeah.
For me, if it can generate a website, because I'm non-technical, that means it can generate a UI for me. It means, it can do all of these things for me, right? So I think there's some stuff that's changing. Just to wrap this up, right? And maybe you get kind of like a last thing here. Do we believe this AI thing from Klarna is BS or not for their IPO only? Or, what's our verdict here in the end?
Let's just say I think they're using it to their advantage. They're probably building a ton with AI. I think they are. I think it landed at an opportune moment for them to say that they're cutting certain tools to get some press. Yeah, they're shaping a narrative for sure. I don't think one rules out the other. I know it's kind of a neat way to cover my own ass, I guess, but that's just how I see it. Like, I do believe they've built these pieces internally. I do think they must have some other mechanisms in place if they've got it Salesforce. You and I even talked about those types of contracts, usually multi-year, So it could be that they are still actually operational, but just used much less.
Yeah, I think it's a head fake. I think it's a great way to own the narrative when you shed half your workforce, by the way. But I also don't believe that, we want to fire those thousands of people. Let's build an AI initiative so we can own the narrative. I don't think it happened like this.
No.
I think they were like, hey, we need to let go of those people. And then in parallel, there was like, hey, let's be more, increase productivity using AI. And then suddenly that took off and worked and worked and worked. Then they kind of made a thing out of that. Suddenly that took off and worked and worked.
Yeah.
And I think now they just went all in with this.
Yeah.
And I think probably all in to a degree where it almost kind of, flips over on the other side. It's like, I think, there are probably a couple of areas where you shouldn't just try and deploy that stuff. But that's our extremely professional opinion on this. And everyone for listening. If you haven't, hit subscribe yet, please do. And otherwise, see you next time. Have a good one. And thanks, Mikkel.
Bye, Tony.